Hi everyone, welcome to week 4. This week we're reading chapter 3 of Beyond Quality in Early Childhood Education, and we're going to be paying attention to the question, who is the child? So on page 43, Dahlberg, Moss, and Pence write that, or they draw on Mayall in writing that children's lives are lived through childhoods constructed for them by adults, by adult understandings of childhood and what children are and should be. So this understanding of who the child is deeply informs pedagogical work and our roles as educators. So in this week's chapter, the authors point to how post-structural theory argues that there are no absolute or sole childhoods, that there is no ultimate image of who a child is, but rather that childhood is constructed. Our images of children are constructed. And borrowing from Silvana Calaprice, if we're interested in education and if we're interested in pedagogy as a social science study, then we must begin with an idea of who the human is. Who is it that's being educated? And with that, who is the child? So what are the theories that inform these discourses that create our understandings or image of the child? This image of the human subject is intimately linked with the purpose of education. Why do we educate? What kind of subject are we trying to create in this project of education? So there are multiple constructions of childhood that are situated within particular socio-geographic locations and theoretical assumptions. So the construction of the child is informed by how we think children are and ought to be. So scientific discourses create a particular understanding of the child, one which positions children as essentialized and naturalized and within a baseline of development that assumes who a child is and who a child will become. So the division of infant, child, youth, and adult is created within social and cultural contexts, which then determine childhoods. And these divisions are predicated on assumptions that are based in developmental psychology. So these transitions across the lifespan are not necessarily universal, but rather they come from a particular theoretical vantage point. So the image of the child and childhood looks different in many places and is dependent upon social, cultural, and political milieu, yet a large dominant discourse, or largely dominant discourses that are informed by developmental psychology, originated in Europe and made their way globally. So it can be argued that child development theory has been and is an expansive and colonial tool that names a baseline of what quality childhood ought to look like and how educators and parents can attain it. So this is visible in child's rights discourses where children's needs are treated as self-evident and neutral, that what one child needs can be assumed for all children without consideration of specific cultural contexts and times. Moreover, children are positioned as in a state of lack, where they're entitled to particular services that perpetuate these developmental logics in the service of their well-being, but a well-being that is informed by a Euro-Western assumption about what a child needs and who a child is. So a dominant discourse in early childhood education is that of the competent child. It's very common to hear the word competency in our field, that the child is already full and comes with a competence that's given, that's inherent. So if this is true, then the role of the educator is informed by this image of the child, of the competent child. So the educator then becomes a facilitator to provide children with experiences that enable them to discover their inherent potential, their inherent creativity, and pre-existing rational formed self. Yet this construction of the child ignores the milieu in which children live and the social dynamics that are constantly making childhoods. And following Caprice, the problem with competence discourses is that it positions children as already made, already knowing. However, children do need to be educated in order to think with complexity. So if the human subject is in constant relation with milieu and the places in which she exists, then pedagogy must also be in response to this changing milieu. And this highlights how if childhood is always being constructed, that pedagogy is also being constructed, that it's not a static practice or something that can merely be applied or an approach or model that is implemented, but rather pedagogy is a response with a social responsibility and intentionality to creating educational conditions and experiences that are in dialogue with the complexity of a child's milieu, her context, and the social-political times in which she lives. So a way of forming and creating subjectivities that will allow humans to live well in particular times. So Calaprice has said previously that pedagogy is not interested in creating happy children, but rather thinking children. And next week we'll go further into a discussion about the image of the child in neoliberal times. Who is the child allowed to be in discourses of these happy childhoods? But I think that some of those ideas definitely lend themselves well to some of our conversations this week. So who we think the child is, again, deeply informs pedagogical work. So if we view the child as an empty vessel waiting to be filled, that's discussed in chapter 3, there will be particular orientations to pedagogy that are based on this image. So the role of the educator is informed deeply by these assumptions. The image of the child as a sponge, as a receiver of knowledge, supposes a transmission of assumed knowledge from the teacher to the child. The child is then filled with knowledge and of a truth that's already assumed, not co-constructed, but disseminated. A teacher then becomes a transmitter or facilitator of learning, and as Biesta has written, as a sort of process manager where the teacher is somehow separate from the act of teaching, but merely facilitates this movement of knowledge, as if she's outside. So if we view childhood as a preparatory age in which children acquire knowledge and skills in order to be successful in job markets and ensure the economic stability of the nation state, pedagogy will then be likely focused on skills-based learning where educators ensure that children are able to perform particular skills that will serve them in the future. So the hope for the child is that they will be autonomous, self-sufficient, they'll be a contributor and a consumer within neoliberal markets. And the purpose of education and the ways of thinking that are created within this rationality are in the pursuit of this kind of human subject. And next week, we're going to go further into a discussion about who is the child again in a neoliberal state, and then how this then informs common pedagogical orientations that we might be familiar with already in early childhood education. So in chapter 4, we'll be discussing the early childhood institution within times of advanced capitalism and unsettling some of the taken for granted logics about what early childhood education is for. So in our reading of chapter 3 this week, we're offered several images of the child that are common in early childhood education. The child as knowledge, identity, and culture reproducer. The child as an innocent in the age of golden age of life, the Rousseauian image of the child. We're also looking at the young child as nature or as the scientific child of biological states. And then also the child and as a labor and market supply factor. And then lastly, the child as co-constructor of knowledge, identity, and culture. And this last image of the child comes from a post-structural orientation. So this week, each of your virtual collaboratory groups will investigate one of these constructions of childhood and create an image of the child that will be shared and discussed on Moodle that's based on this section of the text. So this can be in point form, but it should offer a thorough examination of who this child is within this particular view. So for example, if your group is looking at the section of chapter 3, that's the child as knowledge, identity, and culture reproducer, you'll be taking that section of the text and thinking about these questions in constructing your image of the child. How does the child become knowledgeable from this vantage point? What social, cultural, and economic conditions frame this image of the child? How does this construction of the child understand self? How is the human positioned within this imaginary? How does this construction of the child, oh, I already said that. What is this image of the child in the service of? What does this image of the child do? What is the purpose? And what does it hope for? So your group will respond and post your response in the Images of the Child Moodle forum by Saturday at 11:55 p.m. And then by Sunday, you will each individually compose a response to another group's post. So in your individual response, you're going to select one of the posts from the Images of the Child forum, so another group's post, and write 150 to 200, or sorry, 100 to 150 word paragraph that enhances this description of the image of the child in this context. And so this response, individual response, should be well supported by the Beyond Quality text and should utilize at least one direct quote. And that's to say for both responses, your group response and your individual response. These should both be very much situated within chapter 3 of the text and should really utilize the literature rather than being based on your own personal opinions. So again, you're going to be looking at each of these constructions of childhood from chapter 3, and your group has been assigned one of these constructions on Moodle, and then you will respond to that one. So I think that's it for now. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to reading your responses, everyone. Thanks.